Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is yield. And this is another viewer's suggestion. I don't know the viewer's name, real name, but I know they're in Canada and I am so grateful for the suggestion. So anyone watching is always welcome to make a suggestion for a future verb video. But now let's take a moment and talk about how we can use the verb yield. The first way you might encounter the verb yield is to mean to produce an agricultural or industrial product. So sometimes as we talk about farming and crops, you will hear about how much an acre is yielding or how much it is producing of a particular crop. A second way we encountered the verb yield is to mean to produce or deliver a particular result, some type of gain, or even improvement. So the second definition, generally there's a positive meaning to it, assuming the sentence is positive or in the affirmative, meaning that something is producing a result, an improvement. A third way the verb yield gets used is to mean to give way to arguments, demands, or pressure. So the meaning here, I would say, is a little more negative, right? So we have encountered maybe someone with a strong personality or someone who is demanding something, and we're just like, fine, right? So you give in or you give way. You don't continue to argue your side or resist their demands or resist the pressure. They sort of take control of the situation. Related to that is the fourth definition of the verb here, to give way under force or pressure. Another word to think of that might be to collapse. I actually heard this verb used recently. There was a story about a school's roof collapsing from the weight of a great deal of snow. And as someone was describing what happened, right, they said the roof yielded to the weight of the snow, right? So there's that idea of give way or collapse. A fifth way the verb yield gets used is to mean to give the right of way to other traffic. Okay? So with this particular definition, this is very specific to driving, I believe, here in North America. We have particular road signs that indicate one driver should stop as long as there is traffic coming. But if there is no traffic, right, you can go. So many times, if people are approaching this type of intersection where there's this sort of sign, they're paying attention. If there's nothing else around, they're continuing. They might be slowing down, but never coming to a complete and full stop. A sixth way to use the verb yield is very specific to government debates. So what this does, someone might say, I yield my time, right? And what that means is they are they're giving the time they had been provided to speak on a particular issue, they're giving it maybe to another colleague, back to the chair, but they're going to stop talking and allow someone else to begin. You should know that yield is a regular verb. To make the progressive form of this verb, all you need to do is add ing to form yielding. The past tense and participle forms of this verb can be made by adding ed. Now our base verb yield ends in a d sound. This means when we add an ed ending, we're going to add an extra syllable. The sound we make should sound like this, id. So the past tense and participle forms of this verb should be pronounced like this, yielded. Okay. Now, you might encounter a couple phrasal verbs. I thought it might be good to discuss their meaning and have some examples. The first one that's pretty common is to yield to. And this can be used in a couple different ways. One way would mean to allow someone in front of or before oneself. So again, we might hear this a lot in connection to driving. An example of this might be, you must yield to oncoming traffic. Right? So this is telling us that one direction of traffic has the right of way. They get to continue, right? And we go back to that idea of pausing and waiting until it's clear before we proceed. Okay. Now, another way to use yield to is to mean to submit or to give in to someone or something. An example of this might be, they will never yield to their enemies. Okay, so this suggests they're going to continue fighting. A third way to use yield to is to mean to allow oneself to be convinced or maybe persuaded by another person or another thing. An example of this, I cannot keep candy in the house because I always yield to temptation. So this sentence is suggesting, right, I get persuaded to eat sweet things if it's just sitting around, right? The sight of it tempts me. Okay? Another phrasal verb we might encounter is to yield up. This can mean to give up possession of something. An example of this might be, will he yield up any secrets? Okay, so we want to know, is he going to tell us or share the secrets? Now, let's continue using our verb of the day in a couple different verb tenses. Today, let's review the present perfect and the simple future with a focus on will. We'll start with the present perfect. We use this verb tense in a few different ways. We can use it to describe something that happened in the past, but at an unknown time. Many times this gets called the indefinite past tense. A second way the present perfect gets used is to describe an action that started in the past and continues into the present. Now, when we make sentences in the present perfect, we have to pay attention to our subject. If our subject is I, you, we, or they, I use have, and then the participle form the verb. But if the subject is he, she, or it, I use has, and then the participle form the verb. Here's an example. The representative from Iowa has yielded her time to the representative from Nebraska. Again, this goes back to that sort of formal definition we talked about earlier, where during a debate or where legislation is being discussed, right, sort of sharing or giving one's time to someone else. So the representative from Iowa is stopping his or her speech here. Now, if you want to make a negative sentence in the present perfect, again, you're going to pay attention to your subject. If the subject is I, you, we, or they, use have not, and then the participle form the verb. Here's an example. This land hasn't yielded any profitable crops in several years. Okay? Here, this land is singular. It's like saying it. So you're going to notice a slightly different pattern. If my subject is he, she, or it, I use has not, and then the participle form of the verb. Okay, so this sentence goes back to that very first definition, right? We're saying no crops have been produced in several years, right? Maybe there's something bad in the soil, or perhaps the climate change is having an impact on being able to grow something successfully. Finally, let's talk about making yes or no questions in the present perfect. To do this, you start with have or has, whichever form matches your subject, that subject comes next, and then you use the participle form of your verb. Here's my last example. Has the summit yielded any results? So here, summit, you might think of several countries coming together, several different parties meeting to resolve something, right? And here we want to know what results have been produced. Now let's move on and talk a little bit about the simple future. Today we're going to make sentences with will. Will is extremely common when people are making predictions and promises and offers. You might also hear it some with plans, particularly if they're not really certain about plans quite yet. The nice thing about making sentences with will is that our structure stays the same no matter what our subject is. So in the affirmative, we're going to have subject, will, and then the base verb. You can see that in my example sentence. The icy morning will yield to warmer temperatures tomorrow afternoon. This might be something you hear a meteorologist, a person who's on TV talking about the weather, right? Here, right, the icy morning is going to give way to warmer or increasing temperatures. That's what that sentence means. Now, if you want to make a negative sentence in the simple future with will, again, we start with our subject, we use will not, and then the base verb. Sometimes you might notice the contraction will not being shortened to won't. W-O-N apostrophe T, won't. Long O there. Okay? An example of this might be, our country won't yield to the invaders. Okay? So again, this would be the I'm not going to give up, right? We're going to continue fighting. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question. To do this in the simple future, we start with will, we have our subject, and then the base verb. Here's the last example. Will this project yield any environmental benefits? So again, we're looking for some positive results from some particular project. Now, let's spend a moment looking at some words that are related to our verb yield. And the first word we're going to discuss is the noun form of this word. When the noun yield is used, it can have a couple different meanings. We're going to talk about two of them today. The first is to describe the amount of an agricultural or industrial product. So sometimes as crops are harvested, right, they start talking about what is the yield. This could be on an individual farm, it could be by a state or country's form of production as well. An example of this noun in a sentence might be, the corn yield was the state's largest in history. So the full amount of corn produced by some particular state, right, is saying this is the biggest since it's been, since records have been kept. A second way you might encounter the noun yield is more common in the area of finance. So if you work in finance, you might hear people talking about the yields on certain investments. This is really referring to the interest that one is getting from some type of investment or some could be some type of revenue from a particular tax. An example of this noun in a sentence might be, the yield on the 10-year Treasury bonds is over 4% now, right? So we're talking about the interest rate and as we're using that noun yield. Got just a couple more words for us to discuss. Yielding can also be used as an adjective. I know we talked about that being the progressive form of the verb, but as an adjective, it means that someone or something is likely to or inclined to give in. Something is likely to be submissive or be compliant. We'll take a look at an example of this. Our supervisor is too yielding. Senior managers walk all over him. Right? So in really large organizations, right, we might have a structure where there are many managers, senior managers, directors, right? So kind of all these levels of bosses. And here someone is kind of looking one level up, right, and saying, this person, he or she gives in to whomever is above them. They're too compliant. Maybe they're not fighting for us or advocating for us. Our last word that we're going to discuss today is the adverb yieldingly. So here we're describing something that is being done in a rather obedient or even submissive manner. I feel like I have seen this adverb used most commonly in literature, describing how a particular character is talking to or interacting with other characters. So it might be something a bit like this. She spoke softly and asked yieldingly, right? So what we can picture with a sentence like this, right? Somebody is not speaking in a strong way. They're not demanding, I get this or I be able to do this, right? They're very soft. Another word you might hear with that is kind of passive, not trying to offend, and certainly not really strongly advocating for himself or herself in this case. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.